So over the last couple of weeks, it seems that our format is changing a little bit. So much news coming out of the Ukraine, so much of it related to Poland, obviously, the things we see every day in our everyday lives. And so we kind of decided to separate these news stories from our regular news program. And so this week's, we need a name for this, guys. The Ukraine catch-up summary. Well,
that's a snappy title.
I know, really. I know, it's a good one, isn't it? It's a really good one.
What's it?
Well, we'll go back to work on that, but we do need a name for this.
Special KrakCast operation in Ukraine.
Ukraine news this week. It's kind of bullet pointy. We just comment on different things that are in the news. Oh, and by the way, our friend Owen is here. He was with us earlier this week for the regular news. Now he's with us for the Ukraine news. So, Owen, welcome back.
Hi, everybody.
So let's start with this. Dr. Mike, Poland, like most countries, has like an auxiliary backup force to the main army.
The Territorial, it's kind of like the National Guard.
National Guard, or in Britain, what do you call it? The Territorial?
The Territorial Army Volunteer Reserve.
Okay, so same thing in Poland, and they are reporting that in some places they're seeing an increase of as much as 50% in interest in volunteering. Good sign, I guess, that the fighting spirit is there, or a bad sign that more people are expecting to have to pick up arms?
I don't think a lot of people are expecting they might have to pick up arms, but I think it's a good sign that people are feeling motivated and not looking for a way out, but thinking more that, it's my duty or it's my responsibility or I can help. So in that sense, it's scary that we might be approaching an actual armed conflict, but at least people are aware of this and are, stepping up, prepared to step up.
We're going to have an episode dedicated to this exact subject in about 2 weeks or so with some other guests that are going to join us. But Dr. Mike, as our resident token Polish person here in the studio, what's your take on the topic? A very interesting and difficult topic, and there's no right answer, but it's a very emotional subject. We see how the Ukrainians have responded in terms of fighting back. And of course, we have, it's only fair to include the fact that many of the men there are forced to stay. They don't have the option of leaving the country. But if, God forbid, Poland was faced with a situation where we had to fight, let's say the Russians, what's your gut feeling on let's put it in percentage terms, the percentage of the adult male population that would stay and fight versus fleeing to the West?
The thing is, a lot of the people I hang around with are like young, urban hipster types that I'm not convinced would want to get involved. And to be honest, I'm not sure if I would want them to get involved in any type of actual armed conflict.
You wouldn't want them holding a gun?
Yeah, the only good side is maybe they would soak up a few bullets before they hit me.
Oh, what a friend you are. What a friend you are.
A friend in...
So your gut feeling is the percentage would be rather low?
Actually, I think...
Generally?
I'm saying... No, actually...
Or just in your circle of friends?
I'm kind of joking around. I think actually it would be quite substantial. I think more of people who could contribute...
50%?
I would say, if not more. I'm saying
at least half.
At least half would...
We're talking adult military-age males here.
Military-aged men would do something. If they can't pick up a gun, then, dig ditches.
Well, as I said, no right or wrong answer here. It was just a matter of opinion.
I just made sure my second passport was still valid. But
Well, I can't help thinking, of course, this has to be always, like with any news, really, that we're getting out of Ukraine or, of course, from Russia, it has to be taken with a pinch of salt because, of course, there's obviously attempts to... propagandize or to give, a good or a bad impression depending on which side you're on and so forth. But one does seem to get the very strong impression that the Ukrainian armed forces are considerably more efficient, better equipped, and, never mind the motivation, which is obviously very high, than the Russians kind of initially expected. And one can't help but think, if that's the case with the arguably dismissed kind of concept of Ukrainian military from as recently as 6 months ago, Polish armed forces, which have been kind of active in, Iraq and Afghanistan and are part of NATO and are reasonably well equipped, and it's a non-conscript army, regular soldiers, blah 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 blah. I think that there's a level of confidence that if the Russians were dumb enough to expand the war beyond Ukraine's borders into NATO territory, that they really would have hellfire. Kind of.
But is the fact you bring up the Polish army, is the fact that the Polish army is obviously much better funded and equipped than the Ukrainian army. Couldn't you use that as an argument to support the idea that more normal people would flee because they say, look, this is what we have an army for. It's their job to fight, not mine. That's why I'm leaving, and I'm leaving the army to do it.
Well, I think that's a very good point, but I think that this is a very powerfully emotional issue, isn't it? And I mean, I think the whole issue with what's been happening in Ukraine is the Russian underestimation of the national spirit of Ukrainian people. I mean, seemingly bizarrely, even those who are ethnic Russians who don't even speak Ukrainian, only speak Russian, have nevertheless, so strongly identified with their Ukrainian nationality that they're absolutely not going to countenance a Russian invading force.
Oh, and what's your take on this, your gut feeling on how the Polish population would respond to a conflict here? Would they stand and fight like the Ukrainians, or were they more likely to leave?
Well, I mean, the Poles have a very long history of standing and fighting when they've been put up against the wall. So I think a lot of them would stand and fight. And I think also the effect of what's happening next door and what's happening here now with the migrant crisis, I think a lot of Poles themselves are surprised at their own reaction to the migration crisis. I mean, had we been sitting down with a bunch of Polish people in a bar a few months ago saying, hey, 3 million Ukrainians are going to arrive here, and you're going to invite them into your homes, or all your sports centers are going to be closed down to house these people. I mean, this would just be mind-boggling. And it's happened. And it's happened so naturally and so swiftly and with such a degree of engagement that it's astonishing for me. And I think for some Polish people, they're even surprised. And well, if it turned to armed conflict,
I think it's been an opportunity for Poles to properly regain and reclaim their national pride. Really, I mean, I think all of us who are outsiders who've lived here for many years have always been intrigued by this kind of odd, almost kind of ambiguity in the Polish character, which is on the one hand being fiercely proud of their nationhood, but at the same time slightly surprised that anyone would want to come and live here. They'll be happy to put the country down in every sort of way, but at the same time, this sense of nationhood is very strong, and I think that obviously has a historical basis, given that the country didn't exist for 123 years. And nevertheless, as a nation, as a people, it never wavered, really. And when they came back properly.
Dr. Mike?
Well, the one thing I would mention here is that if the war were to spread to Poland, it probably wouldn't look like what it is right now in Ukraine.
Well, yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say.
It would be small fighting, frontier. It would be NATO getting involved, and by the time people who wanted to help would get to the front line would have moved, or it would be a nuclear nuclear mushroom cloud with fallout ash falling on everybody. So
let's not go in that direction quite yet. Let's kind of keep it back down to earth here. Yeah, it would. I was going to point out the same thing, that if the Russians were coming across our eastern border, that would mean that they had a sufficient degree of control in the Ukraine. They consolidated their power. They would be coming here on much different terms than what the Ukrainians are dealing with now. And so it's kind of apples and oranges. But again, we're dealing in theoreticals here. We're just talking no right or wrong answers.
Are we going to talk about your president's visit?
Oh God, don't piss me off yet. Just one more thing. I'll have the last word on this topic of how the Poles would respond. In general, I do think we are softer than the Ukrainians. The Poles are definitely. At the same time, there is, and we all know this is true, this is a very significant portion, I don't know, make up a number, whatever percentage you want to call it, of people who would fight like hell and fight to the death. They wouldn't go anywhere, wouldn't even think about leaving. And so whatever that number is, let's say, I don't know, a quarter of the population would say, look, I'm not going anywhere. I'm ready to fight. The question that I have that we won't go into now, we'll go into this in a couple of weeks when we talk about it specifically in the show, is what are you going to fight with? this is a European nation where private gun ownership is, a theoretical thing almost. What are we going to, sticks and rocks and insults, or how are we supposed to fight? With what exactly? So that's my question. Perfectly willing to fight. My question is, what do we fight with after being essentially disarmed? But anyway, let's move on from this. Let's see. There's a political diplomatic aspect to this, Dr. Mike. Poland's going to get rid of 45 Russian officials, various parts of the Russian diplomatic delegation to Poland, on basically the de facto accusation of them spying in Poland. Isn't this what diplomats do? I mean, are we really surprised that they're spying?
A little bit of nuance. It's kind of like, don't make it too obvious and we pretend not to see it. That's kind of why you have diplomats in foreign countries, not only to communicate, but kind of be informed of each other. So if you know a little bit about your counterparts in other countries, you feel a little more confident about what's going on, so you don't get paranoid. So it's normal that diplomats also do these kind of things to a certain degree, but apparently it seems that the officials working in the Russian mission in Poland have maybe taken that a step too far. There's also talk of another official who was working in several urzędy, in several like government offices in Warsaw, who had access to the private information of Polish citizens and the citizens of Ukraine who had crossed into the border, and was archiving that information and sending it off east.
Is this surprising, by the way, just to interrupt, is this surprising that Russia still has a diplomatic presence in Poland at all right now?
Well, we have diplomatic ties with them, so they have an ambassador here, a consular here, and, a consulate.
Why haven't ambassadors been recalled, given what's happened already?
Unless you're in a state of direct war, then ambassadors are there all the time. You communicate with a nation through ambassadors. That's how these things work. You don't cut off ties just because they're doing something you don't like.
It's more important to keep the communication channel open.
It's even more important now. Unless, persona non grata, calling that for all Russian, say, diplomats in Poland is almost on par with calling for war at that moment. So they might throw out a lot. They might say a specific ambassador has to go, but you still keep connections, you still keep ties. You just say, we don't like this diplomat, you send us somebody else.
I think there's also the thing, as anyone who's familiar with Cold War spy literature will fully understand, is that it's kind of a given that in any country's embassy, there will always be, a percentage of the staff working there.
Cultural attaché.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, the resident.
Yes. Exactly.
And, I mean, it was always certainly between the USSR and the USA during the Cold War. There was like, this colonel in the Russian embassy. I mean, we know he's KGB. We know who, he's kind of like high level contacts are, but they know that we've got RCI, as long as the ship is kind of like more or less steady, then we're not going to rock it. But when, some incident occurs, or someone gets kind of revealed, or a mole gets discovered, then you have this kind of trade-off and people get expelled and, blah, 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 blah.
So, Dr. Mike, when and if ambassadors get recalled and or expelled, then we'll know that things have gone to a higher, more dangerous level.
That's when you have to make sure that your bug-out bag is ready. Yeah,
bug-out bag. Yeah, exactly.
I think there's also one thing to keep in mind. Poland is now hosting. It's heading up the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. That's a rotating presidency every year. This year is Poland's turn to be president. So
great timing.
Yeah. Wow. So I think Poland will probably, even though it's one of the last countries that Russia would ever call up to ask for assistance in mediation, Poland has to stay in the game. Geography dictates that Poland will stay in the game.
That's a very good point.
So
let's move on to this. Let's get this out of the way. Yesterday, as we record this, last night, in fact, the most popular president ever, 80 million votes, gave a speech in Warsaw in which he said, I think I'm quoting directly here, he says, "My God, this man cannot stay in power," which seems to any reasonable person to be a direct call for replacing Vladimir Putin. After he finished, the White House kind of massaged the media. So what he meant to say was that something. And this came a day after, I forgot his quote, when he was talking to American troops outside of Rzeszów, something to the effect that what they were going to see when they were in Ukraine,
right.
The clear implication being that they were going to Ukraine, which was also walked back by the White House communications people. I'm not I'm nowhere near nonpartisan when it comes to anything related to Joe Biden, but is there any way to look at this other than a clear escalation? We can talk about whether it was deliberate or not, whether he knew what he was doing or not, which is open to question. But how do you go step up to a microphone and say, my God, this man cannot stay in power, and not have that described as an escalation of an already tense situation?
Well, of course, this is because Joe Biden and his highly skilled staff at the White House are experts in...
His highly capable vice president, too.
In... Yes, indeed. 3-dimensional chess or 4-dimensional, or whatever the expression du jour is. And by crossing the line with these seemingly careless statements and then having them walked back by the sober face.
What he meant to say was this.
It's like it's introducing that area of doubt and uncertainty into the whole, if you like, of Putin's consciousness. Like, so does that mean they're going to attack or they're not going to attack? And this was something that... I think the least popular president in America's history who,
previous president.
Previous.
We won't say his name because it has magical voodoo consequences.
Made that statement that he was, when he was hanging out with Putin back in the day, and he'd say, well, of course, if you unleash your nukes, then we'll flatten Moscow 20 minutes later. And he goes, of course, he didn't know if I was joking or not, but there was just that little element of doubt in there, and that's just enough to kind of keep the brakes on. And so I'm wondering if Biden, who famously said, "Oh well, if Russia invades Ukraine, then that's definitely not on." Although, of course, if there's a minor incursion, and I mean, you just think, Jesus, Joe, I mean, what are you saying here?
What was the point of the visit? What was he hoping to accomplish? Because whatever it was, he didn't do. He did the opposite.
The whole idea was to show that NATO will back Poland or the eastern flank of NATO. I'm a little bit worried, though, because as you were saying, like small incursion, that's exactly what Putin would probably do. He wouldn't do a full-scale invasion. It's just say trucks with ammunition are going to Ukraine right now. And if you're at war, those are targets. And the question is, they'll destroy those trucks once they're the Ukrainian side. But maybe once they'll fire a missile and it'll hit that truck when it's 5 kilometers still inside Poland. What does NATO do then?
Yeah.
Exactly. And the question is, technically, NATO then is, all bets are off right now. It's like fighter jets should be flying over into Belarus, Russia, and destroying sites right away at that moment. And Russia should at that moment pull back and say, oops, we're sorry, we didn't mean that with a bloody nose. And that's the reaction I would assume they should do right now. You don't react in kind. You react 10 times more. So they don't want to do a little bit more again next time, because that's what Russia's doing. It does a little bit, and if the reaction isn't right away something intense, they'll try it a little bit more. And I'm worried that's going to happen. They're going to hit ammunition supply that's still in Poland or still across the border, and then see what happens. And NATO is going to be like, well, we should, and wag the finger, but we're not really going to do anything.
Well, it's surely no coincidence that while Joe Biden was speaking in Warsaw last night, there were the first kind of rocket strikes on Lviv, 40 miles from the Polish border. And from what I can understand from the news this morning, it was, they weren't civilian targets. It was, industrial facilities that were hit.
So the Russians missed.
That was the first time that Lviv has been targeted, actually, since this whole thing began just over 4 weeks ago.
I can't let this pass. I got a point in. Owen, this is for you, Dr. Mike, Josh, anybody who wants to comment on this. For 4 years, more than 4 years, we were told that President Trump was going to drag us all into a world nuclear war. It was going to be the end of the world. Nothing but hysterical shrieking about this for 4 years. Nothing happened. Had Donald Trump come to Warsaw, right next door to the war in Ukraine, and called directly for Vladimir Putin's replacement. Ousting, yes. And had he suggested, even by accident, that U.S. soldiers were going to see what was on the ground in Ukraine, the ground would be shaking right now because of the convulsions of European media and the European political establishment shrieking and howling in indignation that Donald Trump was trying to drag us all into nuclear war. Looking through the news this morning, I didn't see any of that. Why not? Why are we so forgiving when Joe Biden gets up there and says what he said? And he didn't mean it, and there's nuance to this. Why? If Donald Trump had said it, it would be completely different reaction.
I have to disagree slightly. I noticed even on the BBC News front
even
page.
on the BBC.
Well, no, I mean let's
saying a lot actually.
Which is one of the major kind of media outlets that was relieved when Trump exited the White House, and that finally a safe pair of hands was taking back control.
Oh yeah, everything's fine now. Yeah.
And but there is, okay, maybe you have to read between the lines a little bit, but it does seem to be kind of a slight sense of, okay, he's the president of the United States, but it does seem a little bit sketchy the way he's kind of talking and behaving. So, whilst I agree with the general thrust of what you're saying, John, I think that Joe Biden isn't really getting away with this, certainly from the point of view of the British media.
Well, the media in general, I agree with you, John, that when Trump said anything, he had a bad habit of saying stupid stuff that just gave fodder to the media, but they always presented the worst possible way, interpreted the worst possible way, connected the dots to make it look as bad as possible, like a mispronunciation, a misstatement, whatever. With Joe Biden, first of all, Joe Biden would try to say as little as possible during the campaign to begin with. And if he said something, you would never hear what he said. It would just be the interpretation of what he probably meant to say. And that seemed to be for the longest period of time what would happen. They were just given the benefit of the doubt over and over again. Now they're slightly seeming to be not so keen on doing that. Still doing that to some extent. Definitely not doing what they did with Trump, which was automatically worst case scenario. Every mistake pointed out right away.
I just have to say, listening to Biden last night and reading the accounts of it today has made me nervous in a way that I was not nervous prior to the visit, because a lot of people, maybe people listening to us right now, Europeans generally, they don't take into consideration the domestic American political context. They've forgotten that, in a way, and I'm sorry if this sounds crass to put it in these terms, but this conflict in Ukraine, war, whatever we want to call it, is a godsend for the Biden administration right now. Instead of talking about their idiot energy policy and how it's resulted in record gas prices, inflation, disaster, chaos on the border, all the economic indicators going in the wrong way, problem after problem after problem. Instead of talking about that, we're talking about his leadership in Ukraine. And it switches the spotlight, switches the dynamic. The Democrats are headed for historic beatdowns in what we call our midterm elections in Congress in this coming November. And if they can change the conversation, change the dynamic, which the Ukraine situation allows them to do, their political fortunes could very well change. And so I'm not saying that anyone necessarily wants war, wants to escalate the situation, but it does help Joe Biden's administration and the Democrats generally, as long as the conversation and the focus is on Ukraine and Warsaw and security matters rather than what's going on in America. And
it's also interesting, isn't it, that now that whole issue of his son's laptop, which was completely smothered by the majority of the press in the build-up to
what a surprise, yes,
presidential election, has now been actually clearly but quietly acknowledged by the New York Times, no less, as being...
You have to read down to the 29th paragraph to get that.
Now they can acknowledge that, in fact, it's real and the information on it is real. But let's talk about Ukraine instead.
Okay, but just in case people, and it'd be understandable if you weren't aware of what this whole story was about, but basically Hunter Biden, Joe's not eldest son, because his eldest son died, didn't he?
That's right.
But had a highly paid job working for a Ukrainian energy company. A job for which he apparently had no qualification whatsoever, apart from being the son of the then vice president. And large amounts of money were involved. There was various degrees of politicking, including whether or not certain key figures in the Ukrainian administration of that time should be prosecuted, removed from their job for corruption or allegations of corruption or whatever. And whatever the truth or lack of truth to all of this swirling around, one can't help but think that the Biden family, to at least some extent, has a financial investment in factions within previous Ukrainian governments.
And at a minimum, they've already benefited greatly from those connections.
Right. Yes. And I mean, I can say all of that without fear of contradiction, because that is incontrovertible fact. What we don't know is to what extent and to how much those parties still exist within Ukrainian politics or whether they're related to the Russian side of Ukrainian politics.
Well, and as Dr. Mike just mentioned, also now that even the New York Times, the supposed, gold standard of journalism, can acknowledge that, the laptop is real and the information on it is real, but they can do that because the news can be buried on page 27 or whatever. Same with COVID, by the way, the COVID restrictions, the mask restrictions, which the Democrats were getting beat up for all over the country, still clinging to these lockdowns and all the other associated issues connected with COVID restrictions. They were looking for a way out. Well, the perfect way out was to have the news suddenly focused on a completely different topic. So they've kind of slipped away from all the baggage associated with their position on COVID as well. So anyway, again, just to restate what I've already said 2 or 3 times, Ukraine is good for Joe Biden in the sense that it changes the conversation, and that is the best way to get out of any political problem. So I hope they're not tempted to keep the focus on Ukraine by doing exactly what he did yesterday, which was, I think, unforgivable escalation. Owen.
I just had one other angle on this because
Sure.
we haven't had to think about how those words of Biden's from last night were received in Russia, because those words will have arrived in Russia, in political circles around Vladimir Putin, amongst the general population, those who have been able to get access to that particular media soundbite. And now that is a conversation topic.
Well, I think,
More so
isn't
than
there?
it was
Yeah.
before.
I mean, there's this whole thing about, very roughly speaking, the population of Russia is broadly divided into the sort of 60 to 70% who are entirely reliant on state media, and thus don't really, we can confidently say, have access to what we might call the truth. And these are the people who are, of course, broadly in support of whatever Putin is doing in Ukraine, because they believe that this is a kind of a mission for good and it's attempting to clean up, this
The Nazis in Ukraine.
That's fine, yeah.
However,
God.
the remaining percentage of the Russian population which does have access to external media sources will probably be already fairly well informed about, day-to-day developments and so on. And I think, it will be they that will learn about this more from the kind of perspective that we have. And that won't do anything to change their opinion, which is that they think that they're stuck in a country with a terrible government.
And can I just add one more thing before we move on? And I find this embarrassing, not humiliating, really, as an American, when the White House has to come out and say, no, what he actually meant was this. When Vladimir Putin makes a speech, or when Xi from China makes a speech, nobody from the Russian or Chinese government comes out half an hour later and says, let me just clarify what he said. Just in case there was any misunderstanding. No, that doesn't happen and will never happen.
If he says something, then their websites all get changed. If he makes a mistake about the date, then they're like, okay, actually.
He goes out there, Biden goes out there and just rambles, probably half off script as he's wont to do. And, it's just, again, to see some kind of, someone from the communications department have to call a quick press conference to say, no, despite what you may have heard quite clearly when he said, Putin has to go, or, sorry, what was the exact quote? He cannot be in charge of the country. What did he say?
He must be removed.
He said, my God,
he must not be
allowed to
stay or something like that.
Oh, okay, something like that. Anyway,
but speaking of what the Russian perspective is, I still watch Russia Today, at least the English language version one, because I don't speak Russian, and they were showing a lot of live news a few weeks ago, like when there was the emergency meeting of the Security Council in the UN and the vote. That was all live on Russia Today, followed by commentary. I'm firing up Russia Today during the Biden speech the other day. It's not live. There's some documentary there. And then afterwards, no commentary. And I was checking back and forth for the next 45 minutes, after I don't watch it that religiously. So the fact they didn't respond to it within the first hour really surprised me. And Russia Today, when I watch it now, has completely changed the last couple of weeks. A lot less live content.
I've noticed. Sorry, I used to watch it from time to time just to check in, and we all look at we look at the North Korean news sites. It just
they had some really hot
curiosity
announcers too. They're all gone.
But Russia Today can go to hell. It's just sorry. The presenters on there, they know what they're doing. A couple of them have quit. fair play to them, but I'm done with them.
Okay, I do have the exact Biden quote here,
what did he say?
which is, "For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power."
Okay, that's even more clear than I thought it was.
And then a White House official issued a comment minutes later saying that Biden was not calling for regime change.
No. Of course not. Of course not.
It's like you can see he's looking back and forth with the teleprompter there. So did somebody misspell something?
I don't know. Two more things quickly before we. Sorry, Owen, did you?
No, I was just going to say I really think that was a statement given under a certain emotional.
Well, maybe Biden was going
from his experience.
He wanted to have his own Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall moment.
I think that's exactly right, John. Yeah, it was like
something like that,
and it big statement
just didn't work.
Yeah, but he's less of a Reagan, more of a Carter. So
let me throw a couple more things before we finish here. Both related to market forces. We mentioned before how obviously the sudden presence of so many Ukrainian adults here, most of them women, of course, is going to have some impact on the job market. But we're finding out this week that the Polish government says it's going the other way as well. A lot of the Ukrainians who were already here before the war started, the men who were disproportionately involved in the construction industry, have left to go into the Ukraine, which is great comment on them and their character and patriotism, et cetera, et cetera. But we're looking at it from the economic point of view, and it means a lot of construction sites are suddenly idle, or the work has slowed down. And obviously the Ukrainian women who have moved into the country can't take up those same jobs, and so on the one hand we have
baby and pick up these.
On the one hand, we have a gross surplus of available labor right now. On the other hand, we have a shortage at the same time. It's a paradox, but it's true. In the short term, this has got to be a net negative for the Polish economy.
Well, unless we have a massive investment in more human resources programs.
No, but the truth is, Poland for the last couple of years, it's been getting by mainly on labor coming in from Ukraine. It's not a matter of just cheap labor, it's just any labor, because most Polish people have either moved into more service-based industries or left the country. So even though productivity was high, the need for workers was high, there were just no people available in that field to fill those roles, and Ukrainians coming in fill those roles. I know, but going back to what you're saying about Ukrainians going back, I know for a fact that DHL, who they have about 3,000 couriers, 800 of them were Ukrainian workers. The day that they announced the attacks in Ukraine with Russia invading, of those 800, 600 quit.
Yeah.
And it's similar proportions basically all across the field. Earlier this week, when I heard reports that 2.1 million Ukrainians had come into Poland, that same report said about 260,000 Ukrainians had gone back into Ukraine from Poland, all men. Huge proportions considering
the Ukrainians who have come in, of course, they're grossly disproportionately women, children, and women with children.
Very elderly people.
Yeah, elderly as well, that's true. What do they do? I mean, they need a job, but they have... There's a child care issue. That's assuming that the housing issue has already been resolved. I mean, these people are in a really, really tough spot. They need money, just to survive on a basic level. How is this going to get paid for? Who's going to pay for it?
I mean, Poland has said it's going to cost about 2 billion euros a year for those who have already come in. At the beginning, there was no money, but people were still taking them in. They were finding housing. There was money for food and supplies. After a couple of weeks, the government said that they'll be paying 40 zlotys per person per day if you take somebody in. It's beneficial, but in most cases, that's not why people are taking people in. Yeah. Though there have been some horror stories of, somebody takes somebody in and then finds out for some bureaucratic loophole that they're not going to get money and have kicked them out. The one story was, I think, outside in Wrocław or somewhere where somebody took in a family of 14 and then found out that they're not going to get any money for them and want to kick them out. I know that sounds harsh, but, taking in one or two people, you can do that, but taking in 14 and then finding out that you're not going to get any financial support for that, but those, from what I understood, these people didn't come into Poland directly from Ukraine. They went in through Moldova, and the law was written in such that it was only those who were coming in directly. But then they changed the law. They found some other sources. This family, which was, a large extended family, was found housing literally within 24 hours.
The other economic story this week, we touched on this when we spoke about this topic last week a little bit, is that you may have noticed, if you're looking for an apartment right now, the market is essentially gone. There are no places. Slight exaggeration. Of course, there are places, but many of them are kind of posted by people trying to land a whale, or, somebody willing to pay 5-10 times the going market rate. Suddenly everything is about 20-25% more expensive if you can find it if you can find a place at all. A lot of media stories about this. If you get as far as posting an available apartment, which a lot of people don't, because just through their network of friends, somebody will take it. But if they get that far, posting it on one of the common online sites for real estate, the phone calls come in immediately, and within an hour and a half, you have an offer. It's gone. And interesting bit of economics at work here, but this is not something that can last in the long term. I mean, in other words, the constant rise of prices, the unavailability of apartments, something's got to give.
I mean, it's true. A lot of the Ukrainians coming in right now, they have maybe life savings and they want to find a place, so they they're going to pay for it. But as soon as more people are willing to pay for something, prices go up. This is completely natural. It's not price gouging. It's actually the system kind of filtering things out so people have places to go. If apartments were too cheap, then an apartment that could hold 5 or 10 people is all of a sudden just holding 2 people. If prices go up, then people are a little more frugal with their money. They find apartments that are adequate and don't go overboard, so the next apartment is available for the next person who can pay for it. But yeah, it also means that all us locals are now competing not only...
And by the way, this is a market that was already overpriced.
Yeah. I was about to say, a market
prior to the
locals
conflict.
Already competing with a lot of foreign investment, now competing with immigrants and refugees coming into Poland now en masse. The question is, how long will this last? Are they going to be here for 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, permanently? This is really, nobody knows.
And we touched on this last week, kind of a delicate subject, but sorry, it's simply reality. I mean, given the suffering that people are going through, it seems a little bit insensitive to focus on this. But the fact of the matter is that we are looking at significant increases in our cost of living, almost immediately. At what point will some degree of resentment start to replace the goodwill that has characterized the situation so far? Sorry to dump that on you, but somebody has to take it.
Yeah. Honestly, what you see in Poland right now, in terms of the reaction to the situation, I think it's something that has legs for a while yet. The absolute horror that you see in a place like Mariupol, I mean, it really gives you pause for thought in terms of, God, it costs me 40% more to tank my car now. But look at what these people are going through. And to be honest, if there was just half of the empathy that exists in Poland present in Germany or in France, I think Putin would be in a far tighter corner than he is right now.
I think you raise a good point. We've yet to see just how much help is kind of dormant and ready to go, but not activated yet. I mean, so far, 90% has come from Poland. Poland has shouldered this burden, and to their everlasting credit. But what about when Germany steps up, as a nation, and France and Europe generally and the world? I mean, I think there's a de facto infinite amount of help ready to go when needed.
Yeah. And I would just like to say, I think...
but sorry, that still doesn't change the fact that if you live here, like Dr. Mike says, we still have to pay a premium, real estate wise. So the help is there for the refugees, the people who need it, but the side effect falls on people like us, and nobody's going to help us pay our rent or pay our mortgage, or So, do we have a right to be resentful? I guess is what I'm getting at.
I think we do, but there's probably other stuff that it's probably easier to, with a conscience, be resentful about right now than
like you say, you have to pay some more at the pump, but shut up. People are some people are dying right now.
Like if everybody in Germany resigned from their summer holidays driving around Europe because petrol's going to be too expensive. I mean, really, this would...
Yeah, Germany.
This would really make it... And I just like to say that it's hard to support the Polish government on a multiple number of issues, but in terms of how they've reacted to this geopolitical situation, and what Morawiecki said when he was in Berlin a few weeks ago, that this is a joke, sending 5,000 helmets. I mean, that's, verbally he's really stepping up to the plate there, and he's really, pushing the buttons that really need to be pushed.
You get the feeling that, as you say, they're doing the right thing now, the good thing now, the proper thing now, but you get the feeling that they're also saving their receipts. So when that day comes and they go to Brussels and they say, okay, let's have a look at what you owe us. I mean, they're preparing for, they know that day will come.
Well, no, absolutely, because I think that there's, to a very large extent, there's some kind of public relations battle going on with Brussels because, I mean, I think we mentioned this last week, but there is this ongoing thing that Brussels is currently withholding payments due for COVID on the basis that, and this is not just Poland, it's Hungary as well, that because the domestic governments are not quite in line with how Brussels would like them to be on certain issues. In Poland, of course, it's the the disciplinary system for the judiciary, and in Hungary, God knows, I mean, just because Hungarians are bad according to the European Union, I think, or Orban is bad. Sorry,
but they're still focused on that when.
Yeah, so I mean, you know,
Morawiecki
is kind of, I think, you know, there's a little bit of politicking going on in there in the sense that, you know, they're building up this massive kind of, you know, like kind of global reservoir of goodwill for Polish, you know, generosity and helping out their neighbour in a time of need. There is also, I mean, this is something that I've seen in parts of the British media, which there's apparently that Volodymyr Zelensky kind of is currently considering Poland and the United Kingdom to be his two strongest allies so far in the campaign, in the sense of, I'm sure it's like, you know, warming words with the respective leaders, but also, of course, just in terms of like the most kind of direct physical, material support.
Josh, I'm glad you mentioned Poland's black sheep status in the EU along with Hungary, because it'll segue. Let's sneak one more topic in here before we wrap things up. Poland has its troubles with Brussels going back for some years, as does Hungary. However, given the active role that Poland is taking now and, you know, picking up most of the tab and shouldering most of the burden, is this a chance for Poland to kind of get a clean sheet in Brussels and kind of a reset and start over? I mean, in other words, shouldn't Poland get some credit for what they're doing now? And can that credit be applied to whatever conflict or, you know, headbutting that has gone on up until now? In other words, you know, can we come out on the other side of this kind of, you know, even?
Well, I think so. I think it certainly ought to be the case. But, of course, politics is, you know, a mixture of oughts and ises. And, you know, there's a lot of things that ought not to be happening but do. And whilst I agree with you, I'm not necessarily convinced that will happen.
Mm. No, for sure, a fresh start to the conversation from both sides.
It seems that Poland should be owed at least that, given what, you know, what they're doing now. In terms of not only the financial costs, but just the impact that it's having on its own citizens.
Well, I think, like you know, whatever your views on the pros and cons of the current government, it does seem to me that from a broadly Western European perspective, Poland and Hungary are routinely misrepresented in the media as, you know, it's like, you know, a strongly right-wing nationalist government. Nationalist, yes. I think that strongly right-wing is stretching the point a little bit. I mean, this is a government that is socially conservative, but in many ways is very centre left in terms of you know, the level of
giveaways and
public, you know, the size of the public sector and, you know, that kind of thing.
Basically, the media representation of Poland in the West has been very inconsistent, especially now when we talk about Putin. They'll say like the government here was always friendly when it came to Orban or Le Pen or certain forces in Europe that seemed to always be tied somehow to Putin. But at the same time, they would always say that Poland was whining too much about the threat of Putin and Russia. It's like, oh, it's not such a big deal. So like, wait, you're saying that Poland is tied too closely to Putin, but they're also that Poland is exaggerating the threat that Putin and Russia are presenting. That was the media narrative for a while that I could never really quite wrap my head around because it wasn't rational. And now Poland does kind of have that, you know, we told you so moment. They're basking in that, but they're fortunately not overplaying it because, it's nobody wants to be told that they were wrong too much, especially if you want them to be on your side and help you.
Well, that's our take on this week's bullet pointy list of Ukraine-related topics. We hope to end this as soon as possible, of course. We don't like talking about it, but it's in the news and it affects us here in Poland, and it's something that we need to talk about and people should know about. So as long as we have to talk about it, we will. Thanks again to our friend Owen for coming in and helping us out.
Thanks for the invite.
And don't forget to check out our website, KrakCast.pl. All of our back episodes, almost 400 episodes now, including next week a biography of the guy who invented Esperanto. We all love Esperanto, right? Right, Josh?
Yeah. See.
Very, very convincing answer. Anyway, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the KrakCast.